Aloha, this is ITS128, and we are in Chapter 6. And this is the second video of Chapter 6. I'm going to cover the second and the third quiz in this video. So if we look at where we are, we're this quiz calling a function on calling functions, and this next quiz on whether or not some functions return values and some functions do not. And so it's just understanding how to call, how to define and call different functions, use these different ways. So here's an example. Um, uh, when we call a function, we can either call it like this, where it returns an actual value. If it returns an actual value, then you're able to use it within an expression to replace a value, and you're also able to use it on the left side, on the right side of an assignment statement to assign a value to a variable. So in this case, this function here, this max function, which I think we defined a little bit earlier, takes the maximum of the two parameters and assigns that value to this variable called larger. And so this is an example of a function that is actually used to return a value, and you can use it to, you can assign a variable to that value. This here is a function which we're very familiar with, this print function. This print function does not return a value, so it can just sit there all by itself. However, this max function here returns a value, and as you know, the print function expects a value inside of its parentheses, and that will be satisfied with this max function. It'll return a 4, and what we should see is the value 4 being printed. So here's an example of the parameter of this print functions. It does not return a value. It's just there on a line by itself. It does something, but it doesn't return any kind of value, and so we aren't assigning any variable to what is returned because nothing is returned. And we also don't see this within an expression because it doesn't calculate or doesn't calculate anything. All right, so here's some examples of some functions. This is the max function, which we looked at earlier. It returns the maximum of its two parameters. And here's another function here called main. And we notice that main actually calls max. Down here is where we call main. So what happens here is first we call main. These are just definitions. We just define these because we're going to use them later. So we define a function called max, we define a function called main, and then down here we actually call main. We actually call it to execute it. And so this calls this main function. This main function doesn't return anything, you notice. It's not on the right side of any assignment statement. It's just there all by itself. And you can see it sets I equal to a value, it sets j equal to a value, and then it calls max. This max is gonna return something. See, there's a return statement in here. It's gonna return the result of this, whatever comes out of this if statement here. And so that's a value is gonna appear there. It's on the right side of an assignment statement. So that value that appears there is gonna be stored into K. And then this print statement is executed. It prints out I, J, and K. So that's how that works. So let's, and here we see that the order in which these are called, this call to the main first function executes the main function. Inside here, we call this max function, which returns a value right there. It gets stored in the K. It's printed out, and when it's all done, it goes back to main, and the program ends over here. All right, so we're going to do this first quiz here, and I'll tell you something about these the last two quizzes in this chapter. This is quiz 6.3 and quiz 6.4. Each quiz question is only one line. The answer is only one line. So let's look at question number 1 here. And here, given that add, we have a function called add, and it expects 2 integer parameters, and it returns the sum, okay? And so we have these 2 variables called Euro sales and Asia sales. They're 2 values. They've been defined. They contain values. And we're just supposed to write a statement that calls the add function to compute the sum of Euro sales and Asia sales. And this add function does return a value, returns the sum. So what this question asks is for us to assign the sum, which is the result of this, assign the sum of this and this equal to this Eurasia sales. So we're looking at something like EURASIA underscore sales, associates that value, the add computes equals add Euro sales and Asia sales. So it's going to look something like that. You can try that out and see if it works. Next, we've got this function called print larger. It's a function that expects 2 parameters and returns no value. Since it returns no value, that means it's just going to be sitting there all by itself. It's not going to be on the right side of any assignment statement. It's not going to be inside within some expression. It's not going to return any value or anything. So all it is it's a function called print larger. Takes 2 parameters. One of them is sales 1 and sales 2. They've already been defined, and so any statement that calls so we want us to write a statement that calls print larger, this function, and passing it these 2 parameters. So that's very simple. It sits up there all by itself. It's not on the right side of any assignment statement or anything. Pass it 2 parameters, something like that. This one here, it's assume that to the power of is a function, expects 2 integer parameters, and returns the value of the first parameter raised to the power of the second parameter. So we're going to have the function name here, which is function name, which is going to be something like this, and it's going to return something to the power of, compute the cube side raised to the power of 3. This to the power of, and it's going to associate that value with cube volume. So we're going to have some function here, some cube volume. That's going to equal some function name, which is this thing. I'm not going to give you the complete answer. This is that, and there's 2 parameters here, the comma in between, and one of those 2 parameters. One of those parameters is this cube raised to the power of 3. So it's this raised to the power of this. This is the function name. So you put this here as the function name, and you're going to put cube side here, and you're going to put the 3 here. And so when this function executes, this function name is actually this. When this thing executes, with this thing being here and this thing being here, it will return a value which will be associated with this cube volume variable here. So you can fix this so it's right. Question number 4, max is a function that expects 2 integer parameters and returns a value. So that means it's something, it's on the right side of an assignment statement or something, write an expression. whose value is larger of the population and calling it max. Well, you know, it's an expression, which means it's gonna evaluate to a value. So it's not. So it would be something, you know, something equals an expression, and this expression evaluates to a value. So we're just supposed to write an expression. So we're only supposed to write this part, and it's max, and it's going to be something, and it's going to be something. It's the maximum of these two things. Put those down here, and we're just supposed to write this. This looks like a statement because it's got an equal sign. This comes, the value comes back, but we just want the expression part. So we do not need this part. We're only looking for this part. But you got to fill this in because we're writing an expression, so it just sits out there all by itself. It does return a value. This is not a valid statement because it's an expression. A little confusing. All right. All right. Question 5. We've got another function called max2, which expects 2 integer parameters, returns a value, just like max1 looks like. So we've got 4 variables here. And we want the maximum of all of them. So what we can do is we can just, let's use this max2 function. It only takes 2 parameters. So let's use the max2 function and find the maximum of these two. And then let's use this max2 function again and find the maximum of these two. And then let's use the max2 function one more time to find the maximum of this maximum and the maximum of this maximum. Find the maximum of those two maximums. And these values have already been defined, so we don't have to worry about those. Write an expression, just like before. And so what we're doing is we're writing a max2 of something, max2 of something. So this is going to be one thing. This is going to be the max of population 1 and 2, and then we're also going to do the max of population 3 and 4. And so this is going to be a number, and this is going to be a number. So because this returns a value, this is just going to return one of the two values. This is going to return one of the two values. So we've got just one value in here and one value in here. Well, that's what max2 is asking for. It's asking for one value here and then one value here. And so this thing is going to return what the largest of all these. Because this one will give us the largest of the first two. And by the way, we don't have to put population 1 in here, population 2 in here, population 3 in here, and population 4 in here. We don't need to put them in order. We can put them in any order because whatever 2 we put in here, this is going to give us the bigger one. And whatever 2 we put in here and here, this is going to give us the bigger one. And then we got a bigger one here and a bigger one here, and we want the bigger of the bigger ones. And that's what this will give us. So that should take care of that question. Let's move on. And let's move on to the next quiz, quiz number 4. These are functions with or without return values. We've already been talking about those. Some functions return a value, some functions don't return a value. If the functions do not return a value, then and you want to use them, they just sit there all by themselves. They are their own statement. If the function does return a value, though, then we usually see it in an expression, within an expression, or we'll see it all by itself on the right side of an assignment statement, like here. Here, the float is a function. It's a built-in function that we've been using. This float function takes takes one parameter, and that parameter is going to be something that's going to turn in, that's going to look like a number. It's going to look like a floating point number. This ends up being a string, but it's going to be something that looks like a floating point number, and then this function is actually going to turn it into that number, a value that can be used in a calculation. And so it returns that value, and that value is going to be stored in this variable here, this score variable. And then this print grade function here, it's a function that does not return anything. That's why it sits here all by itself. But what it does is it prints out the grade, and so it's going to print out score. It takes this thing. This is going to be a value. It's going to be a value that was assigned here. You see. So anyway, there are functions that return values and functions that don't. We've been talking about those a lot already. Let's see what the quiz has for us. So there's just 6 questions here. Let's look at the first question. Assume that print error description is a function that expects one integer parameter and returns no value. Write a statement that invokes print error description, passing it the value 14. Well, this is quiz 6-4. You know, these are just so easy, right? They're just so terribly easy. Okay, this is the function. It sits there all by itself. We're writing a statement, doesn't return anything, so it's a statement all there all by itself. And it takes a parameter. It expects one integer parameter, and here we're saying we want that integer parameter to be 14. So we can just pop that right in there, and there it is. Try that. Okay, here it's a function called send signal. There's no parameters for this function. Write code to call the function named send signal, and there are no parameters for this function. So it doesn't tell us whether or not it returns a value or not. Let's assume it does not. It's got no parameters. If it's got no parameters, you still need the left and right parentheses, but that's about it. The third one here is write the code to call a function whose name is send number. There's one argument. It's an integer. Send 5 as an argument to the function. So we're going to send a number, and the argument's going to be 5. So the function's going to look like this, and there's a parameter in there, and it's just going to be one parameter argument. By the way, when we are defining functions, we're talking about, like, let's say we define a function. You remember 6.2 here? Remember we had a function that looked like this? Here, let me pop this up here. Remember, this was a function in 6.2. This function called the typing speed, and it returned this value. This is a function that we're defining. It's got 2 parameters. When we define a function, we call the things in the parentheses here, we call them parameters. But when we are calling functions, like we can say down here, Joe's speed is equal to typing speed over, let's say Joe was typed 1,000 words, and it took him, you know, I don't know, 500 minutes or something, 500 seconds or something. Okay. This, when we are calling the function, then these are called arguments. So when we call the function, these are not called parameters, they're called arguments. When we define the function, these are not called arguments, these are called parameters. So when we define a function, what is passed in parentheses are the parameters to the function. When we are calling the function, that's when we're defining the function. When we are calling the function, we pass the function arguments. All right, anyway, so here there's one argument for this function, it's 5, so we're going to just put one argument there. It's pretty easy. That's question 3. Question 4 here is, assume that print today's date is a function with no parameters. Write a statement that invokes it. So it's that. It's a function, so it's got to have at least that. It's got to have at least that. And it has no parameters, so there's not going to be anything in there. Returns no value, so it's going to sit there all by itself. It's not going to be on the right side of any equal sign or anything, or it's not going to be within an expression. So we just need to write a statement that invokes it. Well, what's next? Write the code to call a function named this, and it expects a single integer parameter. So I'm just going to put that here, and there's going to be a thing here, and it accepts a single parameter right in there. Suppose a variable called x refers to an integer, and this send variable expects a single integer parameter. Pass this variable as an argument to this function. So pass this variable as an argument to this function. So we put this x someplace. Yeah? All right, figure that one out. Question number 6. Write the code to call a function named send_to. I'm going to put that down here. And it expects 2 parameters. One of them is a floating point number, and another one is an integer. Floating point number and integer. Invoke this function with this parameter, with this argument. It says expects 2 parameters. The function, when it's defined, expects parameters, but when you call it, you send it arguments. So invoke this function with 2 arguments. This is the floating point one, and we can assume that's the first one, and this is the integer one, we can assume that's the second one. So we put something here, and we put something here, and you can guess what those are. All right, so that takes care of this last quiz, 6.4, this quiz. And that's it for the quizzes for this chapter. And so the next video is going to be on the projects. So see you next time. Thanks for watching.